Hey guys, tonight we begin with a ruin, one of the most iconic buildings of the ancient world, the Colosseum of Rome. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When the Colosseum opened in 80 CE, it wasn't the half-broken tourist magnet we see today. No, back then it was the Beyoncé of Roman architecture, flawless, dramatic, and guaranteed to make the neighbours jealous. Officially, it was called the Flavian Amphitheatre, but nobody bothered with that. Romans just pointed and said, the Colosseum, partly because of the giant statue of Nero nearby, and partly because Flavian Amphitheatre sounded like a bad law firm. The thing was enormous, 50,000 seats, 80 entrances, marble cladding so bright you probably needed sunglasses. It was the ultimate status symbol, an arena built to show that Rome had more concrete, more slaves, and more free time than anyone else on earth. Senators sat in the good seats, peasants squashed up top, but everyone got the same blood-splattered view. Titus, the emperor who cut the ribbon, didn't settle for a casual opening ceremony. He hosted 100 straight days of entertainment. Picture Netflix autoplay, but with more stabbing. Gladiators fought, wild animals were butchered, and in a particularly because we can moment, the Romans flooded the arena to stage naval battles. Who needs running water for the city when you can build an indoor murder lake? And they shipped animals in from everywhere. Lions from Africa, bears from the mountains, elephants, even ostriches. The Colosseum was basically Noah's Ark, if Noah had been a psychopath with a taste for dramatic irony. None of these creatures lasted long, of course, but their deaths made great halftime shows. The audience ate it up. The poor got free bread and free gore, the rich got to feel smug, and the emperors got applause that wasn't accompanied by daggers in the dark. It was political propaganda at its loudest. Sure, your taxes are high, but look, free lions. And the building itself? A marvel. Concrete arches stacked so perfectly that engineers still study them, iron clamps binding the blocks tight, elevators run by sweaty slaves popping animals into the arena like medieval vending machines. The whole structure screamed permanence. In its prime, the Colosseum was perfect. Round, marble-covered, and uncracked. No goats, no rubble, no tourists holding selfie sticks. If you told a Roman it would one day lose half its body, they'd laugh and order another round of executions. Because in Rome, forever meant until the earthquakes show up. If the Colosseum was Rome's crown jewel, it was also its most efficient slaughterhouse. For centuries after its grand debut, the arena doubled as both mass entertainment and mass grave. No one left without seeing blood, unless you were blind, in which case you just got free bread. Gladiators were the main attraction. They weren't all slaves. Some were volunteers chasing glory, which really says something about Roman career options. Win enough fights, and you could earn freedom. Lose, and you were fertilizer for the sandy floor. It was a gamble with worse odds than playing dice drunk in a tavern, but it wasn't just men hacking at each other. The Romans loved variety. Exotic animals were shipped in from across the empire, often surviving weeks of miserable transport only to be stabbed on arrival. Lions from Africa, bears from the Alps, crocodiles from the Nile, all dragged in for the crowd's delight. Ostriches too, because nothing screams entertainment like watching a bird sprint around before someone spears it. The Colosseum was less zoo and more butcher's showcase. The Romans even staged full reenactments of battles. Prisoners of war were dressed up like barbarians, which, to be fair, they already were, shoved into the arena and slaughtered to recreate Rome's glorious victories. Imagine being forced to act in a play where the script ends with your decapitation. That was the Colosseum's idea of theatre. By conservative estimates, hundreds of thousands died inside those walls. Humans, animals, doesn't matter. The Colosseum drank blood like wine. The place became so soaked with death that later generations swore it was haunted. Frankly, it would be shocking if it wasn't. The irony. The building itself shrugged it off. Earthquakes would eventually crack it. Looters would eventually strip it, but centuries of constant murder didn't leave a dent. Stone arches stood proudly while the arena floor turned into a compost heap of bones, sweat, and broken dreams. The structure endured. The humans did not. So yes, the Colosseum became a stadium of bones, not metaphorically, but literally. Every show ended with a clean-up crew hauling out corpses while the crowd cheered for more. Rome called it entertainment. We might call it psychopathy. The Colosseum, meanwhile, just called it Tuesday. The Colosseum's glory days didn't end with a bang, but with a shrug. By the 5th century, the Roman Empire had more pressing problems than funding lion snacks. Barbarians were invading, emperors were being assassinated with the regularity of a Monday morning, and the treasury was emptier than a peasant's breadbasket. Gladiatorial combat, the whole reason this giant stone circle existed, fizzled out. By 404 CE, the last recorded gladiator fight took place, and the crowd had to find other ways to amuse itself, like rioting or complaining about taxes. Christianity's rise didn't help either. Church leaders weren't exactly fans of large-scale murder being treated as family entertainment. It's hard to preach mercy on Sunday and then watch a guy get eviscerated on Monday. So the Colosseum slowly fell out of use. Sure, a few animal hunts and public spectacles limped along for a while, but the heyday of let's watch 50 lions eat 50 prisoners was gone. Rome itself was crumbling, literally and politically. When Visigoths sacked the city in 410, they didn't even bother finishing off the Colosseum. Why waste energy? The place wasn't pulling in crowds anymore. The empire split, the western half died, and the once mighty stadium just sat there. No more emperors showing off naval battles. No more roars of approval as thumbs decided who lived or died. Just a giant arena growing quieter each year, as if the building itself was embarrassed to still be standing while Rome's power was circling the drain. By the time the Middle Ages rolled around, Romans had developed the medieval equivalent of selective amnesia. The Colosseum wasn't the jewel of the empire anymore. It was just that really big crumbling thing in the middle of town. Locals wandered past it daily, probably muttering, "Somebody should do something about that," and then didn't. The saddest part? The Colosseum hadn't even started losing its stones yet. That was still to come. Right now, it was just suffering from neglect. Like a once-famous actor now doing beer commercials. The games were gone, the emperors were gone, and the stadium that once screamed Rome's power was now an oversized paperweight. Rome had stopped caring. And when Rome stopped caring, history started sharpening its chisels. The Colosseum may have shrugged off centuries of stabbing, mauling, and general blood-soaked chaos, but nothing in Rome was built to survive Mother Nature's passive-aggressive fits. By the 9th century, the building was already neglected, the games long gone, and Rome itself was a shadow of its imperial past. Then the earthquakes arrived, and they didn't come to spectate. They came to finish the fight. In 847 CE, a major quake hit the city. The southern side of the Colosseum, that great arc of stone and marble, took the worst of it. Massive chunks tumbled down in a cascade of rock, iron, and centuries of bad memories. What emperors, barbarians, and popes hadn't managed to destroy, the earth itself happily kicked over like a spoiled child knocking down a sandcastle. The Colosseum went from majestic ruin to, well, at least half of it is still standing. The southern side in particular suffered because it sat on less stable ground. Ancient Roman engineers had been geniuses, yes, but even they couldn't outsmart fault lines forever. The northern half clung on, while the south collapsed in stages, leaving the building looking permanently lopsided, like history's most dramatic before and after photo. And this wasn't a one-time event. Rome got more tremors throughout the Middle Ages, each one loosening more stone, each one giving locals new excuses to cart away rubble for personal projects. Every quake turned the Colosseum into the world's biggest clearance sale. What had once been an engineering marvel became a cracked skeleton. Vaulted arches buckled, stairways vanished, and spectators who might have sat comfortably in the second tier centuries earlier would now be looking at open sky and wondering why nobody brought scaffolding. For Romans of the time, though, it wasn't a tragedy. It was opportunity. Huge slabs of travertine lying around in neat piles. Perfect. Why mourn a broken amphitheatre when you could turn its ribs into your new church facade? And the more earthquakes struck, the more free building materials rolled in. The Colosseum didn't just fall apart. It was being politely delivered to the rest of Rome, one tremor at a time. And after the 847 quake, the missing half of the Colosseum wasn't just a possibility. It was already becoming a reality. The Colosseum survived its first big earthquake in 847 CE, looking a bit battered but still recognizable. Like a heavyweight fighter after a rough round, it could still stand in the ring. But the earth wasn't done swinging. In 1349, Rome got hit again, and this time the Colosseum went down hard. This quake ripped through the city with enough force to turn much of the southern side of the amphitheatre into rubble. Entire sections of those majestic arches and seating tiers simply folded and collapsed. It wasn't just cracks and cosmetic bruises anymore. It was structural annihilation. Rome's most famous landmark suddenly looked like a half-eaten cake, and nobody was rushing to bake the missing half-back. Of course, medieval Romans didn't view this as a tragedy. They saw it as divine delivery. All those giant blocks of travertine that once held up emperors and gladiators, now they were lying conveniently on the ground, ready to be reused. Builders, stonemasons and opportunists descended on the wreckage like bargain hunters at a yard sale. Why quarry new stone when the Colosseum was practically begging you to help yourself? The damage was so extensive that the Colosseum never really recovered. The south side remained a jagged ruin, open to the elements, while the north side soldiered on in stubborn defiance. From that point forward, the Colosseum wasn't a full arena. It was a broken circle, a permanent reminder that Rome's glory was officially a thing of the past. And naturally, once pieces of the Colosseum were carted off for recycling, the ruin's fate was sealed. Instead of repairing it, everyone treated it as a public quarry. The earthquake didn't just break the structure, it broke the idea that the Colosseum should remain whole. From then on, its stones would end up in palaces, churches, and fountains, scattered like confetti across the eternal city. The 1349 quake was the fatal blow. Not the fall of Rome, not invading barbarians, not centuries of blood-soaked games. Nope. It was the ground shrugging and saying, enough. The missing half of the Colosseum wasn't planned. It was delivered in one catastrophic tremor, and Rome never looked at its greatest monument the same way again. After the quake of 1349, the Colosseum wasn't seen as a wounded masterpiece. It was seen as a very convenient pile of free construction materials. Rome had officially rebranded its greatest arena from imperial monument to public quarry. Think about it. Why trek out to distant stone quarries when the finest travertine blocks in Italy were lying around in the middle of the city? No back-breaking labour, no transportation problems. Just stroll over to the Colosseum, pry out a few stones, and you were in business. It was medieval recycling, but with less environmental guilt and more vandalism. Noble families got in on the action first. Palaces don't build themselves, and nothing said wealth and power quite like walls made of Colosseum marble. Bit by bit, those fallen arches were carted away and reassembled into the mansions of Rome's elite. The Frangipani family even fortified part of the Colosseum itself, turning it into a personal fortress. Because why stop at looting when you can move in? The church wasn't innocent either. If you've ever admired St. Peter's Basilica, or any number of Rome's ornate churches and fountains, you've probably admired pieces of the Colosseum without realizing it. Popes were more than happy to strip pagan marble from a crumbling amphitheatre to give God's house a facelift. After all, what better way to honour the faith than with repurposed gladiator bloodstones? For everyday Romans, the Colosseum became less a landmark and more a medieval Home Depot. Need a slab for your workshop floor? Help yourself. Need stone for a wall? grab a piece from the arena. The arches that once thundered with cheers now echoed with the sound of chisels hacking away at their bones. The Colosseum wasn't destroyed in one dramatic collapse. It was slowly dismantled by centuries of practicality. Earthquakes gave Rome the rubble. Romans gave themselves permission to cart it off. Piece by piece, the amphitheatre bled into the city around it. By the late Middle Ages, calling it a Colosseum was generous. It was more like an open-air warehouse. The missing half didn't vanish overnight. It was repurposed, swallowed by palaces, basilicas, fountains, and houses. Rome hadn't lost its monument. It had simply rearranged it. The Colosseum had gone from monument to quarry, and once that shift happened, there was no going back. If there's one thing medieval noble families loved more than money, it was flaunting it. And in Rome, flaunting often meant squatting inside ancient ruins like raccoons with titles. The Colosseum was no exception. By the 12th century, the city's elite weren't just carting off its stones, they were moving in. The Frangipani family got there first. These were your classic medieval power players, wealthy, ambitious, and not above declaring, "This half-broken arena is mine now." They fortified the Colosseum, turning it into a personal castle. Forget gladiators and roaring crowds. Picture silk-robed nobles sipping wine in the same arches where lions once disemboweled criminals. It was a bizarre mashup of luxury living and squatter chic. The Annibaldi clan eventually muscled in too, because in medieval Rome, nothing said respectable family home like commandeering a gigantic haunted ruin. They reinforced towers, walled off sections, and treated the Colosseum like a real estate jackpot. It wasn't a stadium anymore. It was prime medieval loft space with excellent views of the city and slightly fewer ghostly screams than average. Of course, nobles didn't exactly repair the place. They weren't interested in restoration. They were interested in using the Colosseum's sheer bulk to project power. Massive stone arches became defensive walls, and once gaping entrances were turned into gates to keep enemies out. Imagine medieval guests arriving for a banquet, having to step around rubble piles and decorative bloodstains from 2 centuries earlier. For ordinary Romans, this was peak absurdity. The most famous amphitheatre in the empire, once Rome's pride, had been downgraded to family fortress with bonus goat pens. It was like turning the Eiffel Tower into a condo complex or renting out the Great Pyramid on Airbnb. And yet, the nobles thrived in their crumbling palace. The Colosseum's enormous presence made them look untouchable, even if the building itself was falling apart. Its stones had once symbolized Rome's unstoppable empire. Now they symbolized the egos of families who couldn't stop fighting over which half of a ruin belonged to them. So while earthquakes weakened the Colosseum, it was noble ambition that turned it into a parody of itself. Rome's greatest arena wasn't a monument anymore. It was luxury real estate with a side of rubble, medieval chic at its most ridiculous. If the noble families were shameless about squatting in the Colosseum, the popes were even less subtle about dismantling it. By the Middle Ages, the papacy had figured out that God's house looked much holier when it was decorated with stolen pagan marble. And what better source than the largest pile of pre-cut, high-quality stone in all of Rome? So the Colosseum became the Vatican's unofficial quarry. Need a wall for a basilica? Grab some travertine from the amphitheatre. Fancy a marble column for your palace? Don't waste time carving one, just rip it straight out of the Colosseum. After all, it wasn't like the lions and gladiators were going to complain. One pope after another chipped away at the ruin. Pope Gregory the Great is said to have encouraged the reuse of materials from old pagan buildings, and the Colosseum fit the bill perfectly. Later popes happily obliged, stripping out blocks, iron clamps, and decorative marble to repurpose them across the city. The result? Rome's skyline became a patchwork of Colosseum souvenirs. If you admire St. Peter's Basilica today, you're also admiring a few chunks of the missing half of the Colosseum, just disguised as holy architecture. And the irony here is delicious. The very building once condemned as a site of Christian martyrdom was now being cannibalized to glorify the Christian faith. Nothing says divine providence quite like ripping apart a murder arena to build a cathedral. Of course, the popes didn't stop at stone. They also authorized the removal of the Colosseum's metal clamps, those iron staples that literally held the blocks together. Extracting them weakened the walls further, leaving behind pockmarks that are still visible today. It was like pulling nails out of a wooden house and then acting surprised when it collapsed. For everyday Romans, this papal demolition derby was just normal life. Why quarry new material when the Pope had basically declared the Colosseum a divine parts shop? Every new church, palace and fountain sparkled a little brighter thanks to the ruin crumbling in the background. By the time the papacy was done, the Colosseum was less a stadium and more a skeleton, one whose bones had been scattered into every corner of Rome. God may have gotten his basilicas, but the Colosseum had definitely lost half its body in the process. If earthquakes and popes hadn't already ruined the Colosseum's week, medieval scrap metal dealers finished the job. The amphitheatre wasn't just stone and marble. It was held together by thousands of iron clamps, the ancient equivalent of duct tape. These clamps kept the massive blocks of travertine from slipping apart, and the Romans, being practical engineers, even poured molten lead around them to lock everything tight. Centuries later, those clamps became irresistible to medieval looters. Iron was expensive, hard to come by, and vital for weapons, tools, and horseshoes. So why smelt new iron when the world's largest stockpile of ready-made metal was sitting in the middle of Rome? All you had to do was pry it out, and pry they did. The process was destructive, to put it mildly. People hacked away at the stone to dig out the clamps, leaving behind rows of ugly holes and scars across the Colosseum's walls. Each clamp stolen meant another piece of the building grew weaker. Picture someone removing bolts from a bridge because they wanted to sell the scrap, and then acting surprised when the bridge collapsed. That was Rome's approach to cultural preservation. The results were catastrophic. Whole sections of wall shifted and cracked. Vaults sagged. Arches that had survived earthquakes finally gave up. What had once been a model of Roman engineering was now a pockmarked ruin that looked like it had been attacked by a very determined woodpecker with a blacksmithing degree. And the best part? Most of that stolen iron didn't even go into anything glamorous. It probably ended up as nails, tools, or fencing. Imagine trading the Colosseum's structural integrity for a bunch of medieval shovels. That's history for you. One of the wonders of the world undone because someone needed better cutlery. Even today, you can see the damage. The walls of the Colosseum are dotted with those old clamp holes, the visible scars of centuries of theft. Tour guides politely call them evidence of spolia. A less polite term would be proof that medieval Romans couldn't resist free hardware. So if you've ever wondered why half the Colosseum is gone, don't just blame earthquakes. Blame the fact that somebody's great-great-great-grandfather needed to fix a plough. By the Middle Ages, the Colosseum wasn't just a ruin. It was prime real estate. The arches that once echoed with the screams of dying gladiators were now rented out as shop space. Because if history has taught us anything, it's that people will sell vegetables literally anywhere. The ground-level arches, designed to funnel tens of thousands of spectators in and out of the arena, became perfect storefronts. Bakers set up ovens, smiths hammered away at iron, and butchers displayed cuts of meat in the same spots where lions once tore into prisoners. Nothing says fresh product like buying your sausage under a centuries-old bloodstain. And it wasn't just shops. People lived there too. The Colosseum turned into a makeshift apartment complex, with families carving out homes in its hollowed arches. Imagine waking up in the morning, stepping outside your door, and remembering you live inside history's biggest murder arena. For medieval Romans, that was just Tuesday. Of course, these weren't luxury condos. Rain dripped through cracks. Rubble was always a hazard, and occasionally parts of the wall collapsed without warning. But hey, location, location, location. Where else could you live in the heart of Rome for free, surrounded by crumbling marble and the occasional goat? The Colosseum's arches also hosted workshops. Blacksmiths, tanners and carpenters all moved in, hammering and sawing away in the shadow of fallen emperors. You can almost hear the marketing pitch. Come for the history, stay for the low rent. The place had officially gone from world wonder to strip mall with haunting ambience. For passing travellers, the sight was surreal. Instead of seeing a majestic amphitheatre, they saw a half-collapsed ruin buzzing with market chatter, smoke rising from chimneys wedged into ancient walls, and children chasing chickens across the arena floor. It was less ruin of the empire and more haunted shopping mall. And the best part? Nobody thought this was weird. Medieval Romans weren't sentimental about ruins. To them, the Colosseum wasn't a sacred monument. It was a very large, very convenient space that just happened to be available. If emperors had known their grand arena would one day house bakeries and shoe repair shops, they probably would have built something smaller and less tempting. The Colosseum had officially reinvented itself. Not as a stadium, not as a fortress, but as a mall. And business was booming. By the time the Colosseum had been downgraded from world wonder to strip mall, it was only a matter of time before it became a barn. And sure enough, the grand arena that once staged naval battles and gladiatorial duels eventually turned into a giant pasture for sheep and goats. Nothing says fall of empire quite like livestock grazing on history's most iconic murder arena. Travellers in the Middle Ages often described the Colosseum not as a ruin, but as a sort of ghostly meadow, with herds of animals calmly chewing grass in the same space where gladiators once fought for their lives. Imagine standing in the world's largest stadium and hearing not the roar of 50,000 spectators, but the gentle bleating of goats. A little anticlimactic, yes, but probably better for public health. Goats didn't care about imperial grandeur or architectural mastery. They cared about weeds, and the Colosseum had plenty of those. Plants grew wildly in its cracks, stairways and collapsed arches, turning the place into an overgrown buffet. Shepherds thought, why not? Free grass. And just like that, the arena of emperors became the cheapest grazing land in Rome. The irony, of course, is that medieval Romans considered this perfectly normal. To them, ruins weren't sacred or untouchable. They were practical. You needed a fortress? Move into the Colosseum. You needed a quarry? Dismantle it. You needed grazing land? Toss in some goats. The ancient world wasn't being preserved. It was being repurposed. And goats, apparently, were excellent tenants. Low rent, minimal noise complaints, just the occasional pile of droppings where Caesar once sat. For foreign visitors, the sight was both shocking and hilarious. Pilgrims and scholars would arrive in Rome expecting to see the legendary amphitheatre, and instead find sheep wandering across the arena floor. One chronicler noted that the Colosseum looked less like a monument and more like a ruined village green. That's medieval for wow, this is embarrassing. In a way, though, the goats were the Colosseum's most loyal fans. They kept showing up century after century, long after emperors, gladiators and nobles abandoned it. If walls could talk, the Colosseum might have said, "Out of all the crowds I've hosted, the goats are the easiest." The blood-soaked stadium had become a petting zoo. Not exactly the legacy the Flavian emperors had in mind. By the Middle Ages, the Colosseum wasn't just a ruin full of goats and workshops. It was also a place of supernatural gossip. Romans had stopped thinking of it as an arena and started treating it like a giant haunted monument. Half church, half ghost story. The logic was simple. Hundreds of thousands of people had died inside those walls. Gladiators, criminals, slaves, prisoners of war, animals. The place was basically one giant cemetery disguised as architecture. So naturally, locals whispered that the Colosseum was crawling with restless spirits. Strange noises at night? Ghost gladiators, obviously. Cold wind blowing through the arches. Must be the souls of martyrs sighing. Goat bleating in the dark. Okay, probably just a goat, but it didn't help the atmosphere. Christians, meanwhile, claimed the Colosseum as a holy site. They believed it was the place where countless martyrs had been executed for refusing to worship Roman gods. Whether that was completely accurate or not didn't matter. The story stuck. Soon enough, Pilgrims were visiting the ruin not for its history, but for its holiness. A place once known for butchery became, paradoxically, a shrine. Popes leaned into this narrative because why not? Declaring the Colosseum sacred was a convenient way to discourage people from knocking it down even faster. It worked about as well as you'd expect. Sure, some respected it as a site of Christian suffering. Others still saw it as a free stone buffet. God's will, apparently, included building new churches with recycled arena walls. The double identity was striking. By day, the Colosseum was a barnyard and bazaar. By night, it was a whispered no-man's land, haunted by the echoes of dying gladiators. People prayed there, avoided it, and stole from it all at once. Only in Rome could a place be considered holy, cursed, and conveniently useful for firewood all at the same time. So, while earthquakes and looters physically tore the Colosseum apart, superstition chipped away at its reputation. It wasn't just a ruin anymore. It was a ruin with baggage. Sacred to some, terrifying to others, and hilariously practical to anyone who needed a roof beam, the Colosseum had officially gone from stadium to shrine to spook house. And it wasn't even finished reinventing itself yet. By the later Middle Ages, the Colosseum had taken on yet another identity. Rome's strangest garden. With earthquakes opening cracks in the stone, looters ripping out iron clamps and no one maintaining the place, the arena slowly turned into a giant planter box. Nature had moved in, and it wasn't subtle about it. Grass sprouted first, carpeting the arena floor where emperors once hosted naval battles. Then shrubs took root in broken stairways. By the time the 14th and 15th centuries rolled around, actual trees were poking out of the upper arches like nature's version of sticking flowers in a skull. To locals, this wasn't alarming. It was just Tuesday. But to later scholars, the Colosseum's greenery was astonishing. By the Renaissance, botanists catalogued hundreds of plant species growing out of the ruin, many of them exotic. Seeds had travelled in centuries earlier, hidden in the fur of lions, the bellies of exotic birds, or stuck to the sandals of gladiators. The result? The Colosseum was basically running its own international greenhouse without asking permission. Imagine being a medieval visitor expecting to see the proud ruin of Rome's greatest amphitheatre, only to be greeted by a jungle sprouting out of its arches. It was less glorious ruin of empire, and more welcome to the world's least maintained botanical garden. If you squinted, you might even mistake it for a hillside, albeit one shaped suspiciously like an oval death trap. Of course, plants did what earthquakes and goats hadn't quite finished. They cracked the Colosseum open further. Roots snaked into the stone, prying blocks apart inch by inch. Every sapling was basically a tiny wrecking crew. Nature wasn't just reclaiming the Colosseum, it was actively helping to dismantle it. Yet, in true Roman fashion, nobody really panicked. Locals shrugged, admired the flowers, and kept carting off marble. The ruin had survived emperors, gladiators, and popes. Why not let weeds have their turn? By this point, the Colosseum wasn't just half missing, it was half garden. It stood as a reminder that even the greatest feats of human engineering eventually double as landscaping projects. The empire had fallen, the goats had grazed, and now the plants were in charge. The Stadium of Bones had officially become the Stadium of Roots. By the time the 15th century rolled around, the Colosseum was less grand amphitheatre and more giant cautionary tale about deferred maintenance. Earthquakes had wrecked the south side, looters had stripped out iron clamps, popes had turned it into their personal quarry, goats had chewed the grass down, and plants were finishing the demolition with slow, steady root work. The Colosseum wasn't just damaged, it was too far gone to fix. Nobody even considered restoration. Medieval Romans didn't restore ancient monuments. They reused them, squatted in them, or ignored them until they collapsed. A massive project to save the Colosseum would have cost fortunes, and let's be honest, nobody was spending money to protect a half-ruin when there were cathedrals to build, palaces to decorate, and wars to fight. The idea of preservation just didn't exist yet. If you wanted history to survive, you wrote it down in a dusty manuscript. Stone? That was fair game for fireproof housing material. The Colosseum, once Rome's loudest symbol of empire, became background scenery, the city's biggest piece of urban clutter. Its missing half wasn't treated as a tragedy. It was treated as an opportunity. Those fallen blocks built homes, churches, even part of the Vatican. The people of Rome had no shame about living in luxury, thanks to the cannibalized corpse of their own past. Travellers and pilgrims passing through the city often described it as awe-inspiring, but not because it was intact. The sheer scale of its brokenness impressed them. Look, they basically said, if this much ruin still stands, imagine how terrifying it must have been when complete. Which is a polite way of saying, wow, this wreck is huge. Meanwhile, everyday Romans just lived around it, selling bread under its arches, grazing goats in its arena, and treating one of the wonders of the ancient world like a neighbourhood backdrop. Restoration wasn't on the table, because to most people, the Colosseum was already finished. Not as a stadium, but as a ruin. By the late Middle Ages, it was simply too broken to save. The Colosseum had gone from centrepiece of empire to oversized quarry to city barnyard, and now it was settling comfortably into its final role, the world's most majestic pile of rubble. By the dawn of the 16th century, the Colosseum was no longer just a ruin. It was a ruin with a second life scattered all over Rome. If you've ever admired a grand church facade, a papal palace, or a fancy fountain in the Eternal City, chances are you've admired a piece of the missing Colosseum. The empire may have fallen, but its stones were still working overtime. Popes were some of the biggest culprits. Why commission expensive new quarries when you could simply peel marble off the Colosseum like wallpaper? The Basilica of St. Peter's, boosted with Colosseum stone. Palaces for the Vatican elite, same deal. The very structure once soaked in pagan blood was now literally holding up the house of God. Divine recycling at its finest. Noble families joined in too. The Colosseum's bones showed up in family mansions across Rome, because nothing said old money like decorating your living room with slabs stolen from the empire's greatest monument. Meanwhile, regular Romans carted off smaller chunks for workshops, floors and staircases. The amphitheatre had gone from world wonder to DIY hardware aisle, and nobody felt guilty about it. By this point, the Colosseum's identity wasn't just fractured, it was distributed. Half of it still loomed in the city centre, cracked and half devoured by plants. The other half was scattered, hiding in plain sight, camouflaged as parts of Rome's new skyline. If you wanted to see the Colosseum in the 1500s, you didn't go to the amphitheatre. You went on a scavenger hunt across the city. And what makes it almost funny is that this cannibalization wasn't seen as destruction. To medieval and Renaissance Romans, it was progress. Why let a giant pagan stadium rot when you could put its bones to good use? To them, the Colosseum wasn't missing half of itself. It was just everywhere. So what happened to the missing half of the Colosseum? It didn't vanish into thin air. It turned into basilicas, fountains, palaces, staircases and chimneys. It turned into everyday Rome. The Colosseum didn't die. It was repurposed, one stone at a time. In the end, Rome didn't lose the Colosseum. Rome became the Colosseum. The beating heart of the Roman legion wasn't the glint of steel or the thunder of marching boots. It was grain. Far more than a simple ration, it was the very engine of conquest. Each soldier carried about 3 Roman pounds of wheat per day in his pack. A heavy burden, but one that meant survival. Without it, the empire's campaigns from the forests of Germania to the deserts of Syria would have ground to a halt. Grain was the universal equalizer of the legion. Whether you were a hardened veteran of 20 campaigns or a raw recruit just tasting war for the first time, your daily allowance was the same. Bread, not gold, was the true currency of Rome's armies. But getting from sack to stomach was no easy feat. Legionaries essentially carried their kitchens on their backs. Among the jumble of kit, helmets, javelins, cooking pots, was the small hand mill, a portable grinder that turned hard kernels into coarse flour. After hours of marching under the Mediterranean sun, the men would sit down in camp, shoulders aching, and begin the tedious work of grinding. It was noisy, exhausting, and dusty, but there was no escaping it. Flour meant bread, and bread meant energy for another day of conquest. The bread itself was nothing luxurious. Sometimes it was baked into rough loaves over embers. Other times it was pressed into flat cakes that could be cooked quickly on heated stones. On long campaigns, soldiers might bake twice as much as they needed, leaving some to harden into what was essentially military hardtack. Chewy, dry, and nearly tasteless, but durable enough to last through forced marches and sieges. It was the taste of discipline, plain, repetitive, but dependable. What made grain so essential was its predictability. Unlike herds of animals, which demanded pasture, or vegetables, which spoiled quickly, wheat could be stored, transported, and rationed with mathematical precision. Roman supply lines were often little more than chains of mule carts loaded with sacks of the stuff. Generals knew this truth well. A hungry legion couldn't fight, no matter how brave its soldiers. Julius Caesar himself once noted that a commander's first duty was to keep his men fed. So when we picture Rome's legions, we shouldn't just imagine shields glinting in the sun or banners fluttering in the wind. We should picture weary men, grinding wheat after a long march, turning kernels into survival, and bread into empire. The sword may have carved Rome's dominion, but grain was the quiet force that sustained it. If bread was the fuel of Rome's legions, then Posca was the drink that washed it down. And no, it wasn't the rich, velvety wine of Roman banquets. Far from it. Posca was sour, sharp, and smelled more like vinegar than any vintage. Yet for the common soldier, it was indispensable. A mixture of water, cheap wine gone bad, or sometimes just straight vinegar diluted enough to be drinkable, Posca was the liquid companion of the march. To the modern palate, it would taste like punishment. To a Roman legionary, it tasted like refreshment, safety, and even medicine. Why vinegar? First, it solved a very practical problem: unsafe water. Rivers and wells were often contaminated, especially in enemy territory, and plain water could make an entire camp sick overnight. Vinegar killed off much of the bacteria that lurked unseen. Mixing sour wine with water not only made it safe, but stretched the supply, which mattered when thousands of men were on the move. In a way, Posca was the legion's version of a sports drink, quenching thirst while reducing the risk of disease. Second, the tangy liquid was strangely invigorating. Marching 30 kilometres under a scorching sun, weighed down by armour, weapons, and a pack that could tip over 30 kilograms, soldiers needed something bracing to keep them alert. That sharp bite of vinegar on the tongue woke a man up better than sweet wine ever could. It was cheap, plentiful, and practical, exactly what a legion required. But Posca wasn't just about hydration. It seeped into Roman military culture. Writers of the time recorded that generals and emperors sometimes drank it deliberately, to show solidarity with their men. Imagine that. A commander, surrounded by luxury, choosing the soldiers' sour brew instead of Falernian wine. It was a symbolic gesture, one that made a leader appear disciplined and close to his troops. To sip Posca was to embody Roman virtues of austerity and toughness. Of course, soldiers joked about it. Posca was hardly glamorous. No poet sang its praises, and no lover poured it at a feast. It was, at best, an acquired taste, but it was also unforgettable. The tang lingered in the mouth, just as memories of campaigns lingered in the mind. For the legionary, it became part of the rhythm of daily life. Bread in one hand, sour wine in the other, and another mile of marching ahead. If wheat was the foundation, and Posca the refreshment, then salted pork was the legionary's anchor. Protein wrapped in salt and necessity. Meat on campaign was a luxury for most of the ancient world, but Roman soldiers were among the rare few who could expect it regularly. Not fresh, juicy cuts, of course. What they got was pork preserved in salt, tough and briny, designed not for pleasure but for survival. Salt was the real magic here. Without refrigeration, pork would rot within days, especially under the blazing Mediterranean sun. But rubbed, packed, and cured with salt, it could last for weeks, even months. Legionaries carried slabs of it in their packs, sometimes boiled in camp to soften the texture, other times roasted on skewers over small fires when time allowed. The taste was harsh, salty, greasy, and repetitive, but it kept them strong. Protein rebuilt the muscles worn down by endless marching and brutal combat. In the words of one historian, it was the soldiers' shield against exhaustion. More than nutrition, salted pork symbolized Roman efficiency. Supply officers, or questors, ensured wagons rolled behind armies with barrels of preserved meat, supplementing what soldiers carried themselves. Where other armies relied on foraging or stealing from locals, the Romans built supply chains as reliable as their formations. Pork wasn't just food, it was proof of Rome's logistical genius. A hungry army might plunder once, but a well-fed legion could conquer for decades. Still, salted pork wasn't universally loved. Imagine chewing on the same greasy, salty slab day after day. Soldiers sometimes joked it was harder to swallow than facing a barbarian charge. When they could, they tried to improve it, mixing it with lentils, soaking it in vinegar, or seasoning it with herbs scavenged near camp. On lucky days, they even traded portions with civilians for fresher cuts. But when nothing else was available, the pork endured, as stubborn as the legionaries themselves. Interestingly, salted pork carried cultural weight too. The Roman army's reliance on it reinforced an image of soldiers as hardy, practical men. No feasting, no indulgence, just salt, meat, and duty. It reflected the Roman mindset that glory didn't come from living well, but from enduring discomfort and still marching forward. So while the poets of Rome sang of feasts with roasted boar and fine wine, the real empire builders, sweaty men in sandals and armour, chewed salted pork by firelight, their faces lit by embers, dreaming not of banquets but simply of another day's survival. If salted pork was the legionary's heavy, briny burden, then hard cheese was his modest comfort, dense, portable, and surprisingly nutritious. Unlike soft cheeses that spoiled quickly, the Romans relied on aged varieties, so firm they could be carried in a pack for weeks without crumbling to dust. Hard cheese gave soldiers fat and protein, a vital counterbalance to the endless bread and porridge. In a world where calories meant survival, cheese was a compact miracle. Cheese held an advantage beyond nutrition, versatility. Soldiers could nibble it straight from their rations, crumble it over grain porridge, or melt it into stews to soften the harsh saltiness of pork. A simple pot of boiling grain transformed into something hearty when a soldier tossed in a hunk of cheese, releasing its oils and flavour. For men who marched 30 kilometres a day and slept on hard ground, these small improvements meant everything. Food wasn't just fuel, it was morale. But cheese wasn't only practical, it was symbolic of Rome's agricultural backbone. Herding was common throughout Italy and the provinces, and supplying cheese to legions reminded soldiers of home. A piece of aged cheese might connect a legionary in distant Syria to memories of his father's farm in Latium. That simple link could turn the drudgery of military life into something bearable, if only for a moment. The army also prized cheese for its durability in diverse climates. Grain could mould in damp weather, pork could go rancid if improperly cured, but cheese, if aged correctly, endured the extremes of rain, snow, and desert heat. This reliability made it a quiet cornerstone of military logistics. Roman supply officers stocked wagon loads of it, knowing it would last longer than fresh food. Of course, cheese wasn't always a delight. Legionaries sometimes mocked it as stone food, because the hardest varieties could nearly break a tooth. The quality depended on where the army marched, sometimes cow's milk, sometimes goats or sheep's, and sometimes whatever the locals could be convinced or forced to provide. Still, even the toughest chunk of goat cheese was welcome after weeks of monotonous bread and vinegar. In the end, cheese may not have the heroic image of swords or shields, but it served as quiet armour against hunger. It was the food that survived the campaign alongside the men, enduring hardship with them. When the fires burned low and soldiers chewed on hardened rations, cheese reminded them that Rome's strength wasn't only in conquest, but in the humble, enduring provisions that kept its armies alive. If bread filled their bellies, pork fueled their muscles, and cheese lifted their spirits, then vinegar kept them alive. To the Roman soldier, vinegar wasn't just an ingredient. It was a toolkit in liquid form, carried in small flasks or mixed into the ubiquitous posca. It was the taste of discipline, a sharp tang that touched almost every aspect of legionary life, from the kitchen to the battlefield infirmary. On the most practical level, vinegar was preservation. Drenching meat or vegetables in it kept rot at bay, allowing the army to stretch rations beyond their natural limits. Soldiers often soaked old bread in vinegar and water to soften it, turning stale, tooth-breaking lumps into something at least chewable. It wasn't gourmet dining, but it meant fewer wasted supplies, and in war, waste was as deadly as enemy arrows. But vinegar's real power was medicinal. Ancient Roman doctors, following the writings of Hippocrates and Galen, saw vinegar as a purifier. Soldiers used it to clean wounds, believing its sting warded off infection. In an age without antibiotics, this was a lifeline. A cut on the march could fester into death. A splash of vinegar was the soldier's best defence. They even gargled it for sore throats, dabbed it on insect bites, and sipped it diluted to ease stomach troubles. To the weary legionary, vinegar was both first aid and pharmacy. There was also the psychological factor. Vinegar sharpened the senses, a jolt to a man dulled by fatigue. Imagine trudging through miles of dust and heat, then pausing to swig sour posca. The shock on the tongue was bracing, almost like a wake-up slap. Roman generals praised this austerity, contrasting it with the indulgence of their enemies. A soldier who could endure vinegar, they believed, could endure anything. Still, vinegar was not universally adored. Legionaries joked about its punishing flavour, comparing it to drinking discipline. Yet they drank it anyway because it worked. Unlike wine, it didn't intoxicate. Unlike plain water, it didn't kill you. It was bitter, yes, but bitterness was part of the Roman way. In the end, vinegar embodied Rome's military philosophy. Simple, practical, and effective. Not designed for comfort, but for endurance. As soldiers doused bread, cleaned wounds, or gulped sour mixtures by firelight, they proved that Rome's empire was not built on luxury. It was built on resilience, sharpened by the taste of vinegar. The Roman legionary was more than a fighter. He was a moving kitchen. Each man carried his own little pantry and cookware, strapped to a furca, a wooden pole slung over the shoulder like a yoke. On it hung a cooking pot, a pan, and whatever supplies he had been issued: grain, pork, cheese, and vinegar. To the modern eye, this may look more like the gear of a poor traveller than that of a soldier. Yet this portable kitchen was the secret to Rome's mobility. Unlike many armies of the ancient world, the Romans didn't rely entirely on baggage trains or civilian camp followers to cook for them. Each soldier was expected to prepare his own meals, either alone or with the men of his contubernium, the squad of 8 men who shared a tent. At the end of a long march, once the camp walls and ditches were dug, the air filled with the clatter of pots and the smoke of hundreds of fires. Bread was baked on hot stones, pork boiled to soften its salt, and cheese melted into stews. In a matter of hours, an army of thousands became a sprawling outdoor kitchen. This system was genius for several reasons. First, it gave the legion autonomy. If the baggage train was delayed or ambushed, soldiers could still feed themselves. Second, it built camaraderie. 8 men, crammed into a tent, cooking, eating, and joking together each night, became brothers as much as comrades. The kitchen was not only a source of food, but of loyalty. Of course, it wasn't always pleasant. After 20 miles of marching, grinding flour, and boiling pork wasn't anyone's idea of relaxation. Smoke stung eyes, bread burned, and more than one legionary probably cursed as his hard-earned meal toppled into the dirt. But discipline demanded routine, and routine bred survival. To skip the grindstone or the fire was to risk weakness in the next day's battle. In a sense, the Roman soldier's kitchen was a reflection of Rome itself. Practical, rugged, and relentlessly efficient. No banquets, no luxury, just fire, grain, and the stubborn will to keep marching. As soldiers stirred their pots under the stars, surrounded by the hum of thousands doing the same, they carried not only their kitchens but the very rhythm of Rome's empire on their backs. A Roman soldier's life was measured in miles. Some days it was 20 kilometres, others 30, sometimes more if urgency demanded it. And through it all, the soldier carried not just weapons and armour, but also his sustenance, his rations on the march. The legion wasn't followed by endless carts of delicacies. It was an army designed to feed itself, to move fast, and to endure. Mobility was Rome's greatest weapon, and food discipline made it possible. The standard ration pack included grain, pork, cheese, and vinegar. But a soldier couldn't always cook while on the move. In those cases, the grain was parched, roasted over a quick flame to make it edible without grinding. It wasn't fine bread, but it kept hunger at bay. Hard cheese could be eaten straight, while strips of salted pork were gnawed on like jerky. Sometimes bread was baked in advance and hardened into biscuits, dense and dry, perfect for chewing during a march. This was food stripped of all ceremony, designed for endurance alone. The Roman army had a word for this discipline: frugality. They prided themselves on needing less than their enemies. While barbarian warriors might feast one day and starve the next, legionaries kept steady, each man carrying several days' worth of provisions in his pack. This made them unpredictable and dangerous. They could appear suddenly in enemy territory, unchained from fragile supply wagons, because their kitchens were on their shoulders. Marching rations also shaped the culture of the legion. Eating on the move became part of the soldier's rhythm: bite of bread, swig of posca, chew of pork. No luxury slowed them down. Even generals like Julius Caesar wrote about how his men could march faster and farther than rivals, precisely because they knew how to ration properly. Hunger did not cripple them, discipline prevented it. Still, there were limits. When supplies ran low, men foraged. They plucked wild herbs, gathered fruits, or seized what they could from villages along the way. Some campaigns collapsed not from enemy swords, but from empty stomachs. For all Rome's logistics, the march was always a gamble. Too slow, and the men might eat through their rations before the next resupply. Too fast, and exhaustion killed as surely as hunger. Yet more often than not, the Roman legion succeeded. The very image of a soldier trudging along the dusty road, pack sagging with food, was the embodiment of Rome's secret weapon. Rations on the march weren't just survival, they were strategy. For days on end, the legionaries' meals were predictable: grain, pork, cheese, and the sour bite of vinegar. But when victory came, food transformed from bare survival into celebration. The Roman feast after battle wasn't just about eating, it was about morale, reward, and reminding every soldier why enduring the monotony of rations was worth it. Feasting usually began when the fighting ended and spoils were secured. The baggage animals, kept out of danger during the clash, were slaughtered first. Fresh meat replaced salted slabs, filling the camp with the smell of roasting beef, lamb or goat. Soldiers who had choked down dried rations on the march suddenly tore into sizzling cuts, juices dripping onto their tunics. Wine, real wine, not the diluted sourness of posca, was uncorked, passed around, and drunk with abandon. For a night, the army shed its austerity and revelled. These celebrations served a deeper purpose. Victory feasts reinforced the bonds of the contubernium and the legion as a whole. Sitting shoulder to shoulder around fires, men who had survived battle together now toasted one another. The simple act of eating transformed into ritual. Meat roasted over shared flames, bread broken and passed, laughter rising above the embers. Even the most hardened centurion knew that food could heal what battle had broken. Commanders understood this too. Generals often distributed captured food as rewards, ensuring loyalty by filling bellies. a leader who shared spoils, whether it was grain from a conquered town or amphorae of wine from seized stores, secured his men's devotion. Soldiers would forgive many hardships if they knew that victory promised feasting. The contrast was part of the magic. Hard bread and sour wine made the fresh meat and real wine taste all the sweeter. Legionaries joked that Rome's empire was built not just on discipline, but on the hope of a good feast after the killing stopped. These moments of indulgence were rare, but they lingered in memory, carried forward into the next grueling march. Yet, even in celebration, moderation was expected. Discipline was never far from the table. Tomorrow might bring another battle, another march, and commanders feared that drunkenness could undo what victory had secured. So the feasts, though joyous, were bounded by order. Romans celebrated not as revellers, but as soldiers who knew duty would soon call again. For one night, though, the campfire was brighter, the food richer, and the laughter louder. In those fleeting hours, victory tasted not of vinegar and salt, but of triumph itself. When we think of Rome's conquests, we imagine gleaming swords, disciplined formations, and banners unfurled against foreign skies. Yet beneath the steel and spectacle lay something far more decisive: food. Rome's true weapon was not just the gladius, but the ability to feed its armies anywhere, at any time, for as long as needed. The empire wasn't built only on blood and stone. It was built on bread, pork, cheese, and vinegar. The genius of Roman logistics was that food was strategy. Legions didn't just fight. They carried the infrastructure of survival with them. Grain mills clattered in camp, portable kitchens fired up every evening, and supply lines stretched like veins across conquered lands. Enemies who relied on plunder or feasting quickly collapsed when campaigns dragged on. Rome, by contrast, could starve its foes into submission, not because its soldiers ate better, but because they ate consistently. Predictability beat plenty. Food also acted as propaganda. A soldier might endure weeks of monotony, but he knew his ration was guaranteed. 3 pounds of grain, salted pork, a measure of cheese, and the sour security of Posca. That guarantee created loyalty. Generals who provided food earned trust. Those who failed saw mutiny. Julius Caesar, Augustus, Trajan, all understood that feeding the soldier was feeding the empire itself. To march without fear of hunger gave Rome an advantage that no enemy could easily counter. Beyond the battlefield, rations tied the soldier to the Roman identity. Eating the same simple diet, day after day, forged a sense of unity. A soldier from Gaul, another from Italy, and another from Syria might not share a language, but they shared bread from the same sack, pork from the same barrel, cheese hardened in the same sun. Food erased difference, shaping an army that thought of itself not as mercenaries but as Romans. Even centuries later, when the empire strained under its own weight, food remained central. Shortages and disrupted supply lines often spelled disaster more than any barbarian spear. The collapse of Rome was as much about the breaking of its breadbasket as it was about the breaking of its borders. So when we picture the legions, we should remember this truth. Rome conquered because it could eat. Grain was the empire's lifeblood, salted pork its muscle, cheese its comfort, and vinegar its shield. Together, they marched farther than any weapon could. The Roman legion wasn't just a war machine, it was a mobile kitchen, and its provisions were as mighty as its swords. To step inside a Saxon mead hall was to step into the very heartbeat of the community. From the outside, these buildings seemed unremarkable. Long wooden halls built from timber, their roofs steeply thatched to shed rain, their walls sealed against wind. But inside, they transformed into something greater than wood and straw. At the centre of it all burned the hearth, a great fire that never seemed to die. Its flames cast dancing light across smoke-darkened beams, filling the hall with warmth, shadows, and the faint tang of ash in the air. The hearth wasn't merely a fireplace, it was a symbol of life itself. In a world where winters were long and the nights seemed endless, fire meant survival. But in the mead hall, it meant more. The hearth's glow drew people together, gathering warriors, lords, poets, and servants beneath one roof. It was here that communities found their strength, not on the battlefield or in the fields, but around the warmth of firelight. At night, the hearth transformed the hall into a theatre of fellowship. Warriors returning from campaigns sat shoulder to shoulder with their comrades, their mail glinting in the fire's glow. Their lord, seated at the high table, was illuminated not only by flame, but by the loyalty of those who pledged themselves to him. Around them, the room buzzed with life. Dogs dozed near the embers, servants carried platters of food, and the scent of roasting meat mingled with the heavy sweetness of honeyed mead. The hall's design itself centered on the hearth. It was no accident that the fire sat in the middle of the space. Every conversation, every feast, every song circled around it. The hearth bound the room together, just as it bound the people within. A Saxon warrior might see the flames as a reflection of his own life, fierce, fleeting, and sustained only by fuel. Without fire, the hall grew cold. Without loyalty, the community would falter. So when we speak of Saxon mead halls, we must first speak of their hearths. They were more than warmth against the chill. They were symbols of unity, loyalty, and endurance. In their glow, strangers became comrades, warriors became brothers, and a hall became a home. The feast was the heartbeat of the Saxon mead hall. More than a simple meal, it was a ritual that blended survival with ceremony, binding warriors and kin together through the act of eating. When the long tables were laid with roasted meats, steaming bowls of porridge, and loaves of coarse bread, the mead hall became something more than a shelter. It became the living symbol of unity. To feast in the hall was to be recognized. A warrior seated at the table had earned his place, whether through loyalty to his lord, valor in battle, or steadfast service to his kin. The distribution of food was never random. It was a subtle language of honor. A man who was given a generous cut of meat, or a place closer to the lord's high table, knew he was respected. In contrast, a lesser warrior, or a newcomer, might find himself at the far end of the benches, his portion smaller, his status uncertain. The feast was as much about reinforcing hierarchy as it was about filling stomachs. Yet the mood of these gatherings was not cold or formal. The mead hall's atmosphere pulsed with life. The clatter of wooden trenchers, the snapping of bones, the laughter of comrades echoing beneath the rafters, all of it gave the sense of belonging. Servants hurried between tables, pouring horn after horn of mead, ensuring the drink of honey flowed as freely as the conversation. With every shared dish and every refilled cup, trust deepened. The feast also served as a stage for loyalty. Lords were expected to be generous, rewarding their warriors with not only food but gifts of gold rings, weapons, or finely woven cloaks. In return, warriors pledged their continued service. This exchange of generosity and loyalty created a cycle that kept Saxon society stable. A feast wasn't just about food, it was about politics, economy, and survival. And in the warmth of the hall, with bellies full and spirits lifted, the harsh realities of life, raids, famine, endless toil, seemed a little farther away. For one night, the hall was a world apart, a place of abundance in a land often defined by scarcity. In Saxon culture, to eat together was to live together. Each feast strengthened the invisible bonds between men and their lord, between families and their community. To be denied the feast was exile. To be welcomed at the table was life itself. If bread and meat filled the body, mead filled the spirit. To the Saxons, mead wasn't just a drink, it was liquid culture, the golden thread woven through every feast and gathering. Brewed from honey, water, and sometimes herbs or spices, mead carried with it the sweetness of summer fields and the labour of bees. In the mead hall, it became something greater, the drink of warriors, poets, and kings. The act of drinking was never solitary. Horns and cups were passed down the benches, each filled and refilled by servants who moved tirelessly through the smoky air. To raise a horn of mead was to share not only a beverage, but a bond. It was the taste of loyalty, fellowship, and the fragile peace of men who lived with war always at their doorstep. Mead encouraged laughter, loosened tongues, and gave courage to those who needed it. Under its influence, warriors told stories, poets recited sagas, and lords made promises that could shape the fate of their people. But mead was more than a social lubricant. It carried symbolic weight. The honey it was made from was considered a gift of the gods, sacred and life-giving. Drinking mead was, in a sense, partaking in that divine blessing. It was thought to bring wisdom, fertility, and strength. No wonder poets compared it to liquid gold, and warriors believed it fueled not only their bodies but their courage on the battlefield. The communal aspect of drinking also reinforced hierarchy. The lord often received the first and finest horn, served ceremoniously by the cupbearer, often a woman of noble standing. This act was more than hospitality, it was theatre. Every eye watched as the lord raised his drink, his authority shimmering in the firelight. When he drank, he confirmed his place as the hall's protector and provider. When his warriors followed, they silently renewed their oaths of loyalty. Of course, there was a darker side. Too much mead could loosen tempers as easily as tongues. Feasts that began in harmony sometimes ended in brawls, with spilled drink and blood mixing on the floor. But even this chaos was part of the mead hall's life, a reminder that fellowship was fragile, maintained by both generosity and restraint. In the end, mead was more than refreshment. It was memory in liquid form, a drink that captured loyalty, celebration, and the fleeting joy of life in a harsh world. To drink was to live, to remember, and to be remembered. At the head of every mead hall sat its master, the Saxon lord or Hluford, literally giver of bread. His role was more than political. It was symbolic, spiritual, and deeply practical. The mead hall existed because of him, yet he was defined by how he conducted himself within it. His authority rested not only on the strength of his sword, but on the generosity of his hand. When warriors gathered in the hall, all eyes turned toward the high seat. The lord was expected to preside over the feast, to welcome allies, and to dispense both food and gifts. Rings of gold, fine weapons, and cloaks woven with foreign dyes were not mere luxuries. They were the currency of loyalty. To give was to bind. Each gift was a silent contract. In return for generosity, the warrior owed service, courage, and unswerving loyalty in battle. This generosity was more than show. In a society where wealth came from land, cattle, and plunder, redistribution kept power stable. A greedy lord who hoarded treasures soon found himself without followers. A generous lord, by contrast, could transform even modest wealth into enduring loyalty. The mead hall was his stage, and every gesture, whether pouring the first horn of mead or offering a carved sword, was part of the drama of leadership. The lord was also the hall's protector. It was his duty to ensure that those who feasted beneath his roof were safe, that no enemy breached its doors, and that the hearth-fire never went out. The hall's glow symbolized his strength. As long as it burned, his people knew they were secure. Stories recited by poets often praise lords not only for victories in war, but for the warmth and abundance they provided in the hall. Yet this role came with weight. A lord who failed to provide food, drink, or protection risked losing his warriors' loyalty. Betrayal in the hall could be as fatal as betrayal in battle. To preside poorly was to weaken the bonds that held the community together. In the end, the Saxon lord was as much a host as a warrior. His hall was not simply a dwelling, but a living symbol of his ability to give, protect, and lead. In the firelight, with warriors feasting at his table, his power was visible, not in isolation, but in the loyalty that surrounded him. If the lord was the anchor of the mead hall, then the poets were its voice. Known as scops or bards, These men carried more than songs. They carried memory itself. In a culture without books or written records, stories were the threads that bound the past to the present, ensuring that warriors' deeds did not vanish into silence. The mead hall, smoky and warm with firelight, became their stage. When a poet stood, horn in hand, the hall hushed. His words could transport warriors back to ancient battles, to the deeds of ancestors who fought giants, dragons, and rival kings. These weren't just tales, they were lessons. Through rhythm and rhyme, the scop taught loyalty, warned against betrayal, and praised the noble virtues of courage, generosity, and honour. A well-told saga was as important as any weapon, shaping how men saw themselves and their place in the world. Storytelling in the mead hall also elevated warriors to near immortality. A man might die in battle, but if the poet sang of his bravery, his name lived on, echoing through the rafters for generations. To be forgotten was true death. To be remembered was glory. Warriors often fought not just for land or loot, but for the promise that the scop would one day sing of them beneath the glow of the hearth. The content of these performances ranged widely. Some were heroic epics, recounting mighty battles. Others were elegiac, lamenting loss and the fleeting nature of life. Still others carried humour or satire, poking fun at rivals or even lords who failed their duties. In every case, the poet wielded power. His tongue could praise or shame, build reputations or tear them down. Often, music accompanied the poetry. A harp or lyre provided a steady rhythm, underscoring the cadence of the words. The hall became a symphony of fire crackling, warriors murmuring, and strings resonating beneath the voice of the bard. In these moments, the mead hall was not only a place of feasting, but of culture, a school without walls, a theatre without a stage. The poet's role was essential. He ensured that victories were remembered, defeats explained, and the values of the community reaffirmed. In the Saxon world, where memory was fragile and death always near, the voice of the storyteller was the closest thing to eternity. The Saxon mead hall was not only a place of feasting and storytelling, it was also a courtroom of loyalty, where bonds between lord and warrior were forged and renewed. Here, under the gaze of firelight, and with the taste of mead on their lips, men swore oaths that bound their lives to their leaders. These were not casual promises. In a world where treachery meant ruin, an oath in the hall was sacred, sealed before both comrades and gods. At the heart of this system was the comitatus, the warrior band. Each man pledged himself to his lord, promising courage in battle and faithfulness in peace. In return, the lord swore to provide protection, food, and reward. The mead hall gave this bond its stage. When a warrior lifted his horn and declared his loyalty, it was not just to the lord sitting at the high table, it was to every man in the hall who heard him. Breaking such an oath brought not only disgrace but exile. The rituals were steeped in symbolism. Warriors often swore with hands placed on weapons, invoking the steel they would wield for their lord. Some touched the communal mead horn as they spoke, linking their oath to the drink that united the hall. The presence of poets ensured that these vows were remembered. A man who pledged boldly in the hall, but failed to act bravely on the battlefield, could expect to hear his cowardice sung of in mocking verse for years to come. Loyalty was also reciprocal. A good lord publicly acknowledged his men's oaths with gifts: rings, swords, shields, or cloaks. These were not bribes, but symbols of trust, visible proof that the warrior was part of his lord's household. The more generous the lord, the stronger the loyalty he commanded. In this exchange, the mead hall became both courtroom and treasury, where promises were forged in drink, memory, and wealth. Yet the oaths went beyond politics. They bound lives together. A warrior's promise meant he would not abandon his comrades, even if death came. Tales told in the hall celebrated not only victories, but the steadfastness of men who died beside their lords rather than flee. Such stories reinforce the hall's central lesson: loyalty was worth more than life. Thus, the Saxon mead hall was more than a place of warmth and mead. It was the crucible of trust, where words carried the weight of blood, and oaths echoed louder than the crackling of the hearth fire. Though mead halls are often remembered as the domain of warriors and lords, women played a vital role within their smoky rafters. They were not merely background figures. Their presence shaped the tone, ritual, and very meaning of the hall. The cupbearer, often the wife, daughter, or trusted kinswoman of the lord, was central to the life of the feast. Carrying the great horn of mead from man to man, she moved with dignity and care, ensuring each warrior drank in turn. This ritual was not simply about serving, it was about order, hierarchy, and respect. To receive the horn from her hands was to be recognized as part of the fellowship. Her role symbolized peace in a world dominated by violence. A woman's movement through the hall softened the edge of rivalry, reminding warriors that loyalty was as much about community as it was about bloodshed. She embodied continuity, linking households together through marriage, kinship, and ritual. In many stories, the moment a queen or noblewoman presented the mead cup was when alliances were confirmed, oaths renewed, and tension dissolved. Her gestures carried political weight equal to any sword. Women were also keepers of memory. While male poets recited heroic deeds, women were often the mourners, their voices carrying laments that reminded men of the cost of war. Their songs, quieter but no less powerful, ensured that loss was remembered alongside victory. This duality, celebration from poets, sorrow from women, balanced the emotional life of the hall. Some women held influence beyond ritual. A powerful lady might act as counsellor to her lord, whispering advice in private but reinforcing it in public through her ritual duties. Her presence in the hall reminded warriors that leadership was not solitary. It was sustained by household and kin. In this way, the mead hall became not just a fortress of warriors, but the heart of an extended family. And of course, women were symbols of continuity. While warriors might die in foreign fields, women carried forward lineages, ensuring the survival of families and tribes. Their presence at the feast was a reminder that loyalty was not only to a lord, but to future generations. Thus, though the mead hall's songs often glorified the clash of swords, it was the quiet, steady presence of women, cupbearers, mourners, and counsellors, that gave the hall its deeper humanity. Without them, the fellowship of warriors risked becoming only noise and blood. The Saxon mead hall was more than a roof over heads. It was architecture with meaning, built to embody belonging and power. From the outside, the hall might appear simple, a long wooden building, its thatched roof pitched steeply against the rain, smoke curling from gaps in the beams. But step inside, and its design revealed its true purpose: to gather, to unify, and to impress. The hall's shape was deliberate. Long and rectangular, with benches running down its length, it naturally directed all eyes toward the high seat at the far end. There, elevated above the rest, the Lord presided, the hearth fire's glow dancing across his face. This arrangement was no accident. It placed hierarchy into the very bones of the building. The physical space mirrored the social order. Lord at the head, warriors ranked along the sides, servants and newcomers toward the edges. Every plank and beam reinforced who belonged where. At the centre burned the hearth, the hall's true heart. Positioned so its smoke rose through the roof's opening, it lit and warmed the entire space. But it was more than practical. The hearth symbolized community itself, the fire around which people gathered, the light that pushed back darkness. No corner of the hall was untouched by its glow. To sit in its warmth was to be part of the whole. To be outside was to be forgotten. The architecture also amplified experience. The high ceilings carried sound, making the clash of laughter, song, and poetry echo grandly. Rafters darkened by smoke became canvases for memory, each stain a reminder of years of feasting. Carved posts and decorated beams sometimes displayed patterns of beasts or knots, linking the structure to myth and tradition. The hall was not just built, it was inscribed with identity. Importantly, the mead hall was a communal space, not private property. Unlike the lord's sleeping chamber or a warrior's tent, it belonged to everyone who had earned a place within it. Its architecture invited participation, long tables for shared meals, benches for collective sitting, open space for poetry and storytelling. It was designed to erase isolation, to make each man feel part of a larger brotherhood. Thus, the mead hall was not only timber and thatch, it was a building that spoke. Its walls reminded warriors of loyalty, its hearth of unity, its high seat of authority. To cross its threshold was to step into belonging, to know one's place within a community bound by firelight and fellowship. Though the smoke of Saxon hearths has long since faded, the mead hall's legacy lingers in story, language, and cultural memory. These wooden halls, once filled with the laughter of warriors and the drone of poets, were not merely buildings, they were symbols of identity. They represented the centre of community life, the place where power was displayed, loyalty sworn, and memory preserved. Even after their timbers rotted, their echoes survived in legend. Epic poems like Beowulf immortalise the mead hall as the stage for both celebration and conflict. Hrothgar's Heorot, the Hall of the Heart, stands as an archetype, golden, bright and alive with song, until threatened by the monster Grendel. The hall, in these tales, is more than backdrop. It is character. Its fall or survival mirrors the fate of its people. The Saxons may not have written much themselves, but their descendants preserved the image of the mead hall as a cultural heart. The hall's influence also shaped medieval concepts of kingship and hospitality. Later, great halls of Norman and English castles carried forward the tradition. High tables, central hearths, communal feasting. Even today, when we picture medieval banquets, we unconsciously trace the Saxon model. The idea that a ruler proves his worth by feeding and rewarding followers is an inheritance from those smoky timber halls. The mead hall's legacy lies not only in architecture or ritual, but in values. It embodied the balance of generosity and loyalty, of storytelling and memory. Warriors sought glory, but it was the hall that guaranteed remembrance. Poets sang of deeds, women passed the horn, lords gave gifts, all within walls that bound the community into one. The Saxon mead hall taught that belonging is built not on stone but on shared ritual. Even modern notions of fellowship, whether in clubs, taverns, or even the idea of a common room, owe something to this heritage. The glow of fire, the sharing of drink, the telling of stories, these are ancient rhythms that continue to define how humans bond. The mead hall may have been unique to its time, but the longing it fulfilled, warmth, kinship, remembrance, is timeless. In the end, the legacy of the Saxon mead hall is not its timber or thatch, but its spirit. Wherever people gather around a fire, lift a drink, and tell stories to remember who they are, the old halls live again. For the Saxons, time was not measured in neat rows of ink on parchment, but in the steady heartbeat of the natural world. The rise of the sun, the fall of the moon, the greening of fields, and the withering of leaves all told them what the calendar could not. Life was bound to cycles, of sowing and harvest, of cold and warmth, of hunger and plenty. And at each crucial moment of these cycles, the Saxons gathered in ritual and feast, marking their place in the great wheel of the year. These gatherings were not frivolous distractions from hard work. They were the glue that bound community together. In a world without certainty, festivals gave rhythm and reassurance. The harsh winter nights, when frost gnawed at doors and the sun seemed reluctant to return, were answered by blazing fires and shared mead. The restless days of spring, when fields demanded planting and warriors sharpened their spears, were marked by rites that blessed fertility and promised renewal. Even harvest itself, exhausting as it was, ended in celebration, a reminder that toil bore fruit and the community would endure another year. Religion lay at the heart of these cycles. Pagan gods and ancestral spirits were honoured at feasts with offerings of grain, meat, and drink. Fires symbolized the rebirth of the sun, while songs carried prayers for good fortune and safety in battle. To participate in a festival was to participate in the sacred order of things, a reminder that man's work on earth was tied to forces greater than himself. Yet these events were not all solemnity. They were also occasions of joy, laughter, and abundance in lives that were otherwise marked by hardship. Tables filled with roasted meats, horns of mead passed from hand to hand, and music echoed through the halls. People sang, danced, and told stories that stitched the community together. The festival was a rare moment when hunger gave way to plenty, fear to hope, isolation to belonging. For the Saxons, then, the year was not a straight line, but a circle. Each festival turned the wheel, marking both an ending and a beginning. Through fire, food, and fellowship, the Saxons not only survived the seasons, they gave them meaning. When winter pressed hardest, when the nights stretched long and the earth seemed lifeless, the Saxons turned to Yule. This midwinter festival was more than a holiday. It was an act of defiance against the cold and dark. The people lit great bonfires, some in open fields, others in the hearths of mead halls, flames leaping high as if to call back the sun itself. Fire was not just warmth, it was a promise, a living symbol that light would return, and that life had not been abandoned by the gods. Yule was marked by abundance, though it came in the leanest time of year. Families gathered in halls heavy with the smell of roasting meats, pork, venison, or whatever the hunters could bring in. Bread was baked, ale brewed, and most importantly, the drinking horns of mead flowed without end. The sharing of food and drink in such difficult months was no small thing. It reinforced solidarity. No one faced the long night alone. If your lord filled your plate and horn at Yule, he was not just feeding you. He was proving his worth as a provider, the one who could lead you safely through scarcity. The religious element was inseparable. Yule fires honoured the gods and spirits of the ancestors, calling for protection through the dangerous winter months. Offerings of food and drink were cast into the flames, smoke rising as a bridge between the mortal and the divine. Warriors often used this time to boast of past deeds or swear new oaths, the fire itself serving as witness to their pledges. Just as the sun would return after its darkest hour, so too would loyalty endure after the trials of war. It was also a time of inversion, when the ordinary rules of life relaxed. Stories tell of games, contests, and mischief, with laughter filling the smoke-filled halls. Yule was not merely a pause from hardship, it was a celebration of survival. Children received gifts carved from wood or bone, tokens of joy to brighten the darkest season. Above all, Yule reminded the Saxons that even in the depth of winter, life still pulsed. Fire blazed, drink warmed, and fellowship held firm. In that glow, they saw not only the end of one year, but the birth of another, a cycle unbroken. If Yule was about survival in the dark, spring festivals were about renewal in the light. As the frost loosened its grip and the first shoots broke through the soil, the Saxons turned to rituals of fertility, celebrations that honoured the earth's awakening and called upon the gods to bless fields, herds, and families with abundance. In a world where one failed harvest could mean starvation, these rites were not quaint superstition. They were urgent acts of hope. The season's rituals often centred on the goddess Eostre, whose name lingers in our word Easter. She was associated with dawn, rebirth, and fertility, her symbols tied to hares, eggs, and the returning sun. Offerings of bread, milk, and honey were made in her honour, placed on altars or buried in the earth as gifts to ensure the land's generosity. Fires were lit at dawn, their smoke curling skyward like prayers for good harvests. Communal feasting was an essential part of these spring rites. Fresh lamb and early greens often marked the tables, along with the last reserves of stored grain. Eating together symbolised shared renewal. The community would not only survive the winter, but flourish in the year ahead. Mead horns circulated, and songs filled the air, many of them celebrating fertility not only in fields, but in families. Weddings and betrothals often coincided with these festivals, binding human unions to the earth's own cycles of rebirth. The rites themselves could be playful as well as sacred. Young men and women participated in games that carried symbolic meaning, races, dances, and contests of strength that mirrored the vigour of new life. Some traditions involved scattering ashes or blessing fields with fire and water, rituals meant to cleanse and fertilise the soil. Every act, whether solemn or spirited, carried the same message. Life returns, and with it, the promise of abundance. For warriors, spring rites had their own weight. The season marked the start of campaigning, when roads and fields were clear enough for armies to move. Oaths taken during fertility rites bound warriors to their lords as firmly as the ploughs bound farmers to their soil. Thus, spring was both a season of crops and of conflict, its rituals shaping not just the year's food, but the year's battles. Spring fertility festivals reminded the Saxons that life was fragile, yet resilient. Every seed sown was an act of faith, every rite a declaration that death and darkness would not have the final word. If spring was about hope and sowing, the harvest festival was about proof and reward. After months of toil in the fields, ploughing, sowing, weeding and praying, the Saxons marked the season of reaping with one of their most important celebrations. The harvest feast was both thanksgiving and survival strategy, a moment when the community could finally see the fruits of their labour piled high before them. The timing varied with the crops, but late summer and early autumn were the busiest months. Barley, oats, wheat and rye were gathered, along with fruits from orchards and whatever livestock could be culled for winter stores. Fields that had once been bare now yielded bounty, and the mead hall tables groaned with roasted meats, loaves of fresh bread, and bowls of grain porridge made from the new harvest. Ale brewed from the fresh barley, and honey-rich mead marked the occasion with drink as golden as the fields themselves. But the feast was not only about filling bellies, it was steeped in ritual. The first sheaf of grain was often dedicated to the gods, sometimes set aside in a place of honour, or burned as an offering. This act symbolised gratitude, and acknowledged that abundance came not by human hands alone, but by divine favour. The harvest feast was as much about appeasing unseen powers as it was about enjoying the visible bounty. The celebration also reinforced community bonds. Everyone, from lords and warriors to farmers, craftsmen and children, shared in the feast. For one night, differences of rank softened, replaced by the shared relief that the stores were full and the winter would be endured. Songs praised not only the gods, but the labour of men and women who had bent their backs in the fields. Dances often followed, their steps echoing the rhythms of planting and reaping, turning hard labour into art. For the Lord, the harvest feast was a moment of generosity. To distribute food and drink freely was to prove his role as protector and provider. To withhold would be shameful. Abundance was expected. Gifts might even be given, tokens of gratitude for loyal service during the hard months. The harvest feast was not only a marker of survival, it was a declaration of continuity. Each year's bounty carried the promise of another cycle, another turning of the great wheel of seasons. In a land where famine always lurked, this festival was both relief and renewal, a reminder that toil and faith could indeed bring reward. Not all Saxon feasts were tied to the soil. Some were born of blood and steel. When warbands returned from raids or campaigns, victorious or merely surviving, the mead hall became the stage for their triumph. These were not quiet suppers but roaring victory feasts, where warriors' deeds were praised, loot was divided, and loyalty between lord and men was reaffirmed in food, drink, and ritual. The feast often began with display. Weapons taken from enemies, captured banners, or exotic goods from distant lands were paraded before the gathered crowd. Warriors seated at the benches waited for their share, sometimes silver, sometimes livestock, sometimes even slaves or jewellery. Yet the greatest rewards were often symbolic, a lord presenting a warrior with a new sword or ring in front of his peers. To receive such a gift during the feast was to be publicly honoured, your courage enshrined in memory. Food and drink flowed as freely as the boasting. Roasted meats, sometimes the spoils of the raid itself, were piled high, and horns of mead were never empty. The atmosphere was electric, filled with laughter, song, and the inevitable contests of words. Warriors would boast of their victories, sometimes truthfully, sometimes with exaggeration, while poets recorded their words in song. These boasts were not idle bragging. They were a kind of currency, a way to establish honour and demand recognition. The victory feast was also a political act. By distributing spoils, the Lord proved his generosity. By rewarding bravery, he secured loyalty. A lord who was stingy or forgetful during such a feast risked losing the respect of his warriors, perhaps even their service. In contrast, a generous feast could ensure loyalty for years. It was no accident that lords often planned the most lavish celebrations after successful campaigns. The hall itself became a battlefield where loyalty was won, not with swords, but with bread and mead. These feasts also carried ritual weight. Oaths of loyalty might be renewed, sometimes dramatically, with warriors swearing on their weapons or raising their horns in solemn pledges. The poet's verses immortalized these moments, ensuring that glory would not fade with the dying fire. For the Saxons, victory feasts transformed violence into order. Bloodshed outside became fellowship inside. The mead hall turned the chaos of war into the structure of loyalty, weaving courage into community through fire, food, and story. For the Saxons, feasting was never only about survival or celebration. It was also sacred. At certain times of the year, food and drink became offerings, bridging the human world with the divine. Religious sacrifice and sacred feasting tied the community not only to one another, but to their gods, ancestors, and the unseen forces that governed fate. The most common sacrifices were animals. Cattle, sheep, or swine were offered during great festivals, their blood spilled as a gift to the gods of harvest, war, or fertility. The act was solemn, often accompanied by prayers, chants, or the lighting of ritual fires. Yet the sacrifice was not wasteful. After the gods were honoured, the meat was roasted and shared among the people. This practice blurred the line between offering and feast. To eat the sacrificed animal was to take part in the blessing, to consume both nourishment and divine favour. These sacred feasts often took place in the mead hall, but sometimes they were held outdoors at sacred groves or stone sites. Fires were lit, food prepared, and horns of mead raised in toasts to deities such as Woden, Thunor, or Frigga. Each toast was both prayer and promise, asking for protection in war, fertility for the fields, or good fortune for the coming season. In this way, every bite and every sip became an act of devotion. The role of the Lord during these feasts was crucial. He acted as both host and priest, guiding the rituals and ensuring the offerings were made correctly. His ability to connect his people with the divine reinforced his authority. A lord who led the feast well showed not only generosity, but spiritual power. His rule was sanctified by fire, food, and the gods themselves. Yet these occasions were not only solemn. Sacred feasts were also communal celebrations. After the sacrifices were made, the atmosphere often shifted to joy. Music swelled, storytellers performed, and the people feasted deep into the night. For the Saxons, piety and pleasure were not opposites, they were partners. To honour the gods was to celebrate life, and to celebrate life was to honour the gods. Religious sacrifice and sacred feasting reminded the Saxons that survival was never a human achievement alone. The gods provided, the ancestors watched, and the people responded with gratitude, offerings, and joy. In those moments, the line between the mortal and the divine blurred, and the hall glowed with more than firelight. It glowed with blessing. No Saxon festival was complete without entertainment. Once the sacrifices were made, the feasting done, and the mead flowing, the mead hall or village green transformed into a stage of laughter, competition, and music. Games, music, and merriment were more than diversions. They were rituals of joy, a way to bind communities through play as much as through prayer. The games varied with the season. In spring and summer, when the weather allowed, athletic contests dominated. Wrestling matches tested strength, while spear throwing and archery displayed martial skill. Young warriors proved themselves before their elders, earning admiration and sometimes mockery if they fell short. These contests were not idle sport, but training for battle disguised as entertainment. Victory brought prestige, and losing built resilience. The community watched, cheered, and remembered. Winter games were often played indoors, within the warmth of the hall. Dice, knucklebones, and board games, such as Taffel, filled the long nights, their clatter echoing beneath the rafters. These games mixed chance with strategy, echoing the Saxon view of life. Fate ruled all, but skill still mattered. Laughter and groans at the fall of dice reminded everyone that luck was as much a player as any man. Music carried equal weight. Harps, lyres, and drums provided rhythm for songs that could stir hearts or soothe weary souls. Skilled musicians could lift the hall into a frenzy or silence it into reverence. Poets and bards recited tales of gods, kings, and heroes, weaving entertainment with cultural memory. To hear one's ancestors honoured in verse was as sweet as mead, and to have one's own deeds sung was to taste immortality. Dance, too, filled the spaces between contests and song. Men and women moved in circles, stamping feet and clapping hands, their motions echoing the cycles of nature and the rhythm of community. Children ran between the dancers, mimicking their steps, already learning the traditions that would one day be theirs to keep alive. But perhaps the greatest merriment was simply the laughter. Festivals allowed space for humour, for jesters and fools to mock even the highest lord, their antics tolerated in the spirit of release. In a world of hard work, hunger, and danger, these moments of levity were essential. They reminded the Saxons that life was not only duty and survival, but also joy. Through games, music, and merriment, festivals balanced the sacred with the playful. They turned survival into celebration, making the bonds of fellowship stronger with every laugh, song, and contest. For the Saxons, festivals were not isolated events, but markers on the great wheel of the year. Each celebration announced a turning point in the cycle of nature, guiding people through darkness and light, scarcity and abundance. Unlike our modern calendars, where dates are abstract numbers, the Saxons lived by rhythms they could see and feel. The thaw of the earth, the height of the sun, the shortening of days. Every feast was both an ending and a beginning. Winter ended with Yule, when fire and mead pushed back the cold and called for the return of light. From there, the cycle turned towards spring fertility rites, which celebrated planting, rebirth, and hope. These were not just rituals of survival, but statements of faith, that seeds buried in the soil would rise, that life would outlast death, that the gods would not abandon their people. Summer brought its own gatherings, often tied to midsummer fires. These flames honoured the longest day of the year, a reminder of the sun's power and a plea that it lingered long enough to ripen crops. Summer festivals were times of strength, when warriors prepared for raids and fields brimmed with promise. Then came autumn, the season of harvest, when the feast tables overflowed and relief spread through every household. The turning of the seasons was not only agricultural, but spiritual. Each shift reminded the Saxons of Weird, the concept of fate. Just as the seasons could not be stopped, so too were human lives bound to a greater order. Festivals gave people a chance to accept that fate, to honour the cycles that ruled them, and to find comfort in their predictability. Communities experienced these changes together. A poor harvest was everyone's hardship, a successful one, everyone's joy. Festivals made the turning of the seasons communal rather than solitary, binding families and clans in the shared acknowledgement that they were subject to the same sun, the same soil, the same gods. In this way, the mead hall fire was more than warmth, the feast more than food, the song more than entertainment. Each celebration was a ritual of transition, a way of walking through the doors of time together. The Saxons did not just observe the turning of the seasons, they lived inside it, their lives as cyclical as the festivals that marked them. Though the smoke of their hearths has long since drifted away, the spirit of Saxon festivals still lingers in the traditions we recognise today. What began as communal fires in wooden halls and offerings of mead to the gods left echoes in later medieval feasts, church holidays, and even the rhythms of our modern calendar. The Saxons may be gone, but their cycle of celebration remains woven into culture. Take Yule, for example. Its fires and feasts survive in Christmas traditions: the blazing hearth, the Yule log, the gathering of families around food and drink during the darkest days of winter. Spring fertility rites, once dedicated to the goddess Eostre, gave their name to Easter, where eggs and hares still symbolise renewal. Even the harvest festival, once steeped in pagan offerings, finds its reflection in harvest thanksgivings and autumn feasts that mark the turning of the year. The Saxons also passed down the idea that community is built around shared ritual. Festivals were not luxuries for them. They were necessities. A man who feasted with his kin was part of the circle, bound by loyalty and memory. To be excluded was to be cast adrift. That sense of belonging through shared meals and song resonates even now. Family dinners, seasonal gatherings, and national holidays all carry the same purpose: to remind people that they are part of something larger than themselves. Their legacy also lives in the tension between the sacred and the joyous. For the Saxons, no feast was purely religious or purely entertaining. It was always both. Sacrifice might be followed by song, solemn prayer by laughter. We too inherit that balance. Celebrations today mix ritual with merriment, ceremony with festivity. Perhaps the greatest legacy of Saxon feasting is its resilience. It proved that in a world often harsh and uncertain, people found ways to affirm life. Fire could chase away darkness, food could soften hunger, and fellowship could outlast fear. These truths are timeless. So when we sit at a holiday table, raise a glass in celebration, or gather around a fire, we unconsciously echo the Saxons. Their festivals and feasts taught that survival was not enough. To live fully meant to celebrate, to remember, and to belong. And in that sense, their legacy still burns as brightly as any Yule fire.